We're following the breaking news on the mass shooting in Orlando, Florida, that's left 50 people dead and more than 50 people injured. The shooter actually called 911 surrounding the attack to pledge allegiance to ISIS and mentioned the Boston bombers, according to a U.S. official. Evan Perez is getting this information for us. Evan's joining us on the phone. Evan, specifically update our viewers what you've just learned.
Well, Wolf, we know that one reason why FBI immediately believed that this was an Islamic attack was simply because of that phone call that the shooter made. He made a call to 911 around that time of the attacks and pledged allegiance to ISIS. Now, the investigation is still ongoing. There's still a lot of information that is not known because the shooter is dead. They're going to have to put a lot of this together. But we do know that he was investigated, at least in the past, by the FBI. And he wasn't the focus of these investigations, but he was suspected of having ties to Islamic extremists and sympathy with Islamic extremist ideology. We're told that those investigations concluded without any action on him, any charges brought against him. And again, he wasn't the focus of those investigations. His name came up as part of an ongoing investigation of other people. Now, the question that will be asked in the next few days, Wolf, is how someone with that past was able to still continue to work as a private security guard for a company that does a lot of work with the federal government. They have contracts to protect federal buildings, and we know that he worked for one of these major contractors down there in Fort Pierce, Florida, where he lived. Again, that's going to be the top of every official's mind, simply because the fact that he had this job, this private security guard license, allowed him to buy firearms with minimal questions asked. He was able to buy at least one of the firearms that was found at the scene, a Glock pistol. He was able to buy that in the last couple of weeks legally from a firearms dealer in the St. Lucie County area. So we know that is the source of one of the firearms, and he was able to do that legally, partly because he had this security guard's license that allowed him to do this.
The 911 call that you've now learned, Evan, do we know specifically what he said on that call? I assume they haven't released the audio of that. They will at some point, but they have not released it yet.
They have not released it, Wolf, and it is part of the investigation. I suspect that it'll be some time before we hear that. I don't know what the contents of that conversation was and why, when specifically it took place. We just know that it happened around the time that these attacks were going on. And obviously he was holed up in that nightclub for several hours. He was talking to investigators. He identified his name to investigators during that time as well, Wolf.
We have not heard any statements, I take it, yet from ISIS claiming responsibility, which raises the question, Evan, was this an ISIS-inspired lone wolf attack, or was this an ISIS-directed, coordinated attack? And I think it's obviously too early to make that kind of determination. Is that what you're hearing from your sources?
Yes, it is too early to make that determination. But really, I mean, I think you talk to officials nowadays, Wolf, and they see very little difference between the two things, simply because a lot of these people who are acting on behalf of ISIS, they do it. They don't necessarily have any specific links to anybody in Syria. As you know, ISIS is under great pressure right now. So some of their best and most active recruiters and online instigators have been killed in some of the recent airstrikes by the United States. So it's not necessarily that he had any kind of communication with anyone. A lot of these attacks are brought on by people who have no links, no direct links. They're simply acting because ISIS is encouraging its sympathizers to do this. This is the holy month of Ramadan, and ISIS and other groups have been out there urging their supporters to carry out attacks during this time, Wolf.
During this month of Ramadan. And one thing, Evan, I know you're doing more reporting, but the family members telling federal authorities in their initial conversations that Omar Sadiqi Mateen also had anti-gay feelings. What else can you tell us about that? This was a nightclub. This was a club, the Pulse Club, which was frequented by the LGBT community.
That's right, Wolf. This is the first indications from the family in their interviews with the FBI and with investigators. Their suggestion is that he was acting out of hatred for gay people. That's what his motivation was. Obviously, this is only part of the investigation. The FBI is also obviously looking at the possible ISIS ties, his possible sympathetic views with regard to ISIS and Islamic extremism. But they're obviously, they can be very related. ISIS, as you know, has carried out killings of people it suspects of being gay in the territories it occupies. So they're very anti-gay in their propaganda, and so that's, it could be part of that as well.
Evan Perez doing important reporting for us. Evan, we're going to get back to you once you get some more information. Let us know. In the meantime, I want to bring in our CNN security analyst, Juliet Kayyem, our CNN national security analyst, Peter Bergen, and our CNN intelligence and security analyst, Bob Baer. This notion of a copycat attack or an ISIS-inspired attack, Peter Bergen, you've studied this for a long time. What's your initial reaction?
Well, Wolf, every single lethal terrorist attack in the United States since 9/11 has been carried out by somebody who wasn't affiliated formally with any terrorist organization. That was true of the San Bernardino couple. That was true of the shooter in Fort Hood, Texas. That was true of the Tsarnaev brothers. And so we have seen that the attacks that have taken place in this country have been lone wolf attacks. They've been inspired by foreign terrorist organizations. Sometimes a foreign terrorist organization may even try and direct, but there's no training. There's no really formal connection in these attacks.
And so your initial suspicion is this was a lone wolf inspired by ISIS ideology?
Yes, and we've only seen, and again, since 9/11, every attack has been carried out either by a lone wolf or by a pair of brothers in one case and a couple in another case in San Bernardino. We're not seeing large groups of people, as we saw in Paris or Brussels, trained by ISIS or some other foreign terrorist organization carrying out these attacks.
And Juliet, the fact, as Evan Perez just reported, that this individual, Omar Siddiqui Mateen, would place a 911 call and pledge his allegiance to ISIS on that call, what does that say to you?
Well, it basically says this is a guy, just picking up on what Peter said, a man who was inspired by ISIS, wanted credit to have been inspired by ISIS, and basically wanted to make himself known. So in this way, it's very different than Boston Marathon. Remember, they left. They did not want to get caught. They had no exit strategy. So this is very different in that regard, but someone who wanted his radicalization to be known in a very direct way. I mean, calling into 911 is unique for these kinds of cases.
It is pretty, Bob Baer, it is pretty unusual for a terrorist engaged in a massacre along these lines to actually go out and make a 911 call and announce, I am with ISIS.
Well, Wolf, I think what we're seeing here is that he didn't want to get caught in advance by getting on a website and claiming, he was going to do this. He didn't have much time. He wanted to get in there, total surprise, wanted to claim ISIS, inspiration. And this guy was a disciplined shooter as well. And I agree with Peter and Julia. There's probably a lone wolf, but inspired by the ideology of the Islamic State. And the fact that it was against a gay club fits right in with the Islamic State's ideology.
Because of the hatred of homosexuals, of gays, of the LGBT community, because we've seen all these reports over the years of what ISIS terrorists have done to those suspected of being homosexuals. They've thrown them off the top of buildings, they've burned them, and they've killed them. This is sort of common over there if someone is suspected of being gay, right?
Exactly. I mean, it's in fact in all of Islam, it's gay, any sort of gay, LGBT is not permitted, but particularly with the Islamic State, and they've actively gone out and executed people they suspect of being gay.
Peter Bergen, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, I mean, we saw in the San Bernardino case, Wolf, you recall that the female in the couple, she pledged her allegiance to ISIS leader Baghdadi. Moments after they had completed the execution of 14 people back in December in San Bernardino. So we've seen something analogous to this 9/11 call, but not a 911 call in the case of San Bernardino, but something where the perpetrator announces in a sort of public fashion that they're taking responsibility for ISIS.
And we had also heard reports, and Paul Cruikshank, our CNN terrorism analyst, is joining us as well, Paul, that in the course of this massacre, he apparently was screaming some words in a foreign language, unclear what language that was during the course of the massacre. What, if anything, are you hearing about that?
Well, we're not hearing a great amount of detail about that, what language it might have been in. We understand he may have been of Afghan descent, or whether it was perhaps in Arabic. But we've seen in past attacks, often the attackers shouting the phrase Allah Akbar. We saw that during the Paris attacks. These attackers believe that this is the final stage of their life and that they are going to be rewarded in paradise for doing what they do. He clearly wanted the world to feel that this was an ISIS attack, but no evidence at this point that he had any connection at all to ISIS himself. But it would appear he was inspired by the ISIS call for attacks. And just a couple of weeks ago, one of their senior leaders, Abu Muhammad al-Adnani, called for a surge in terrorism in the United States during Ramadan. Ramadan started just a few days ago. ISIS has told their supporters, if you launch attacks during Ramadan, you'll be rewarded tenfold in the afterlife. Plenty of motivation for their supporters.
You know, Juliet, what's also pretty stunning, if you think about it, he apparently had been on the FBI's radar in connection with 2 investigations, but he still managed to work for a security firm, a private contractor that had federal contracts protecting federal buildings, and was able to go ahead and purchase weapons.
That's exactly right. So the pieces that I'm asking myself, or the questions are, did this particular company that he worked for have government contracts in Florida? We do not know that yet, because these companies are huge. They're hiring thousands of people. The second issue is, of course, he's on being viewed by JTTF. He did not do anything that would have gotten him on a terror watch list, nor even if he were on that list, would that have precluded him from buying weapons. We know that there is a gap between the terror watch list, is quite political, and getting weapons. The third thing is, we talk about inspired by ISIS. There's 2 types of inspiration at this stage. One is passive and one is active. So this investigation is determining, is this a guy who was just absorbing a lot of stuff, a lot of information online, but never had direct contact with ISIS, you know, in back channels, or might we find out that there was direct contact? It's still, you know, these things make a difference for law enforcement purposes in determining future threats, and also just to have answers for all of the victims and their families.